The first time you walk into a city you have never seen before and feel an unsettling sense of déjà vu, you might think it is your memory playing tricks on you. A courtyard that looks strangely familiar, a staircase that creaks in the same rhythm as another thousands of kilometers away, an apartment kitchen where the same thin glass tumblers sit beside the same metal sink. The realization creeps in slowly, almost like a secret shared between buildings. People here grew up in places that looked exactly like this, and so did people in distant neighborhoods and distant republics, separated by language and landscape, yet framed by the same walls. It raises a question that refuses to settle. How did entire cities become nearly indistinguishable? And what did it feel like to live a life inside such planned sameness? Before explanations arrive, the image lingers. A woman opening a cupboard in a small Khrushchev-era apartment finds a stack of chipped white plates stamped with the mark of a state porcelain factory. A paper calendar with a red ribbon hangs beside a ration booklet that has been kept like a relic, its pages worn soft from the touch of fingers. On the table sits a letter folded into careful squares, telling of a move to a new city where the streets already feel pre-lived. The handwriting is careful, hesitant, describing hallways that smell of plaster dust and boiled cabbage. There is wonder in the letter, but also unease. The city promises progress, but its rooms feel predetermined. Why do strangers in distant regions seem to inhabit the same apartment with the same furniture and the same view of the same courtyard? The tension begins here, in the quiet uniformity that looks harmless at first glance. Rows of 5-story blocks stretched along wide avenues, built from concrete panels that left faint seams like scars along their surfaces. In winter, snow pressed itself into those seams, and children traced them with mittened hands, inventing games that mirrored lines on hundreds of other buildings across the Union. The repetition was not accidental. Every wall was the result of instructions that descended from planning committees into drafting rooms, from drafting rooms into factories, from factories into the lives of families who hung coats on identical hooks in identical entryways. A city could be assembled like a household item, complete with instructions and parts. Yet the lived experience inside those walls was never as clean as the plans on paper. The official language spoke of rationality, of equality, of the dignity of shared space. But residents remember other details. The way sound traveled through the thin plaster between apartments, the nightly radio murmurs that bled through the walls, the clang of pipes that carried heat from a central boiler. In a hallway in Minsk, a boy recalls how his neighbor's alarm clock woke him each morning as reliably as if it were his own. He later discovered, during a visit to relatives in Kazakhstan, that their walls carried noise in the same strange way. He stood there in the unfamiliar apartment, watching sun filter across the same patterned linoleum, and felt a chill. The distance between the two places suddenly felt smaller than the corridor outside. Central planning had a logic that seemed unassailable at the time. The housing shortage was immense, and the promise was clear. Factories would produce standardized parts, architects would follow standardized plans, and the dream of shelter for all would become reality. But what happens when the parts that assemble homes also assemble identities? When thousands of stairwells echo with the same footsteps, do memories begin to resemble each other too? Imagine a child opening a wardrobe built from the same light veneer that filled countless apartments. A surface that flaked if cleaned too eagerly. A smell of pressed wood and glue. Inside, folded sweaters shared space with a small box of keepsakes. A ticket stub from a cinema that looked like other cinemas. A school notebook from a classroom lined with the same wooden desks. That child grows up believing this is what a home looks like, what a street sounds like, what a life is supposed to feel like. Years later, when visiting a city far from home, they climb a staircase and, without thinking, turn right instead of left because the logic of the building dictates it. The confusion that follows is subtle yet piercing. If every hallway leads to an identical door, where does memory live? The sameness emerged from architectural logic, but expanded into something emotional. Standardized layouts were meant to embody equality. Each household would receive the same kitchen dimensions, the same living room proportions, the same small balcony where laundry fluttered across the continent like identical flags. But in the quiet of evening, when residents pulled curtains closed and set kettles to boil on the same two-burner stoves, the promise of utopia was filtered through lived disappointment. Walls cracked, water pipes dripped, and furniture made in distant factories arrived with the corners already worn. What looked uniform in planning diagrams became uneven in life. Still, inside these repeating spaces, people tried to carve out uniqueness with fragile gestures. A lace doily stitched by a grandmother sat atop a television built in a state electronics plant. A jar filled with coins collected over years rested beside a small religious icon tucked into the shadow of a bookcase, safe from cautious eyes. In Novosibirsk, a former factory worker remembers the first rug his family owned, bought with saved wages and laid across the patterned parquet. He describes the pride in that rug, the way it turned a standardized living room into a declaration, however small. When he later visited friends in Vilnius and found the same rug in the same corner of a nearly identical room, the pride shifted into a complicated feeling. Comfort from familiarity, sorrow from the realization that even their attempts at individuality echoed each other. The shape of childhood across these cities mirrored the architecture that housed it. Courtyards framed by identical blocks became arenas for games and first friendships. The same metal playground frames stood in Leningrad, Riga, Dushanbe, and beyond, their paint peeling in similar layers, revealing the same reddish undercoat. Children learned to locate themselves, not by distinctive landmarks, but by counting stairwells, by memorizing the cracks in a concrete walkway. In diaries preserved by families, entries describe birthdays celebrated in narrow kitchens where tables were unfolded from the wall, expanding briefly to hold plates of salad and sliced bread before folding back to preserve precious space. The handwriting may change from city to city, but the scene repeats with uncanny familiarity. Migration intensified the sameness. Workers were sent to new industrial centers, carrying with them a small suitcase, family photographs, and a state-issued document promising an apartment in a new block under construction. Letters from these migrants speak of excitement mingled with disorientation. In one letter, a teacher writes to her sister about a newly built neighborhood in a Central Asian city. She describes the dryness of the air, the brightness of the sky, and then, as if surprised by her own words, admits that the apartment looks almost exactly like the one she left behind. The same brown door, the same narrow hallway, the same fragile shelf above the sink for soap and shaving brushes. She wonders whether she has truly left or simply been placed into a parallel version of her old life. The ideology behind this system insisted that personal identity would flourish through collective belonging, that comfort came from knowing everyone shared the same basic conditions. Yet the emotional truth was more fragile. Residents speak of a quiet pressure, a sense that their lives unfolded within pre-measured rooms, that their dreams had to fit within walls they had never chosen. A young couple in Kyiv recalls the day they received their key, a small brass object that gleamed with promise. They walked through the empty apartment, their voices echoing off bare plaster. They placed a ration booklet on the windowsill and imagined the future. But that night, as they listened to the pipes hum and the neighbor's footsteps above, they felt an uncanny sensation. This was their home, yet it already felt like someone else's life. The sameness extended beyond architecture into the structure of daily routines. Standardized city layouts placed schools at predictable distances from housing blocks, with grocery shops and clinics arranged according to diagrams drafted in distant offices. People navigated their cities like maps already memorized, even when they had never seen them before. A man who moved from Siberia to the Baltic coast remembers walking through his new neighborhood and knowing instinctively where the bakery would be, where the bus stop would appear, where the statue in the central square would stand. The familiarity was practical, almost comforting, but it also erased the thrill of discovery. He described it as stepping into a city that had been waiting for him, not because it welcomed him, but because it had been built to receive anyone in exactly the same way. Inside the apartments, the material world reinforced this atmosphere. Factory-made furniture arrived in kits, the same varnished cupboards and collapsible tables that were celebrated in propaganda posters. Photographs from family albums reveal living rooms arranged with near mathematical similarity, a wall unit filled with porcelain figurines and teacups, a sofa bed covered with a patterned blanket, a small radio perched on the top shelf. Even the imperfections matched. The corners of the tables chipped in the same places, the veneer peeled along identical edges, the linoleum cracked near the doorway where boots struck the floor each winter. Objects that should have told unique stories instead recited a shared script. Yet, in this landscape of repetition, people found subtle ways to resist or soften it. A child taped photographs of astronauts to a bedroom wall, claiming a piece of the universe inside a space measured by bureaucrats. A grandmother cultivated a row of potted plants along the balcony railing, turning a standard concrete balcony into a hanging garden that smelled of damp soil and leaves. A student painted a small wooden box with bright colors and hid letters from a distant friend inside it, letters that described feelings rarely spoken aloud. These gestures did not transform the architecture, but they carved out emotional territories within it. Memory, too, began to mimic the architecture. People who grew up in these cities often recall not a single place, but a collage of similar rooms and courtyards merging into one another. When they try to describe their childhood home, they hesitate. Was the kitchen window facing the courtyard or the street? Was the stairwell painted green or blue? The uncertainty does not come from forgetfulness alone, but from living in spaces where details repeated so thoroughly that they blurred into a shared mental landscape. Urban sameness did not simply shape how cities looked, it shaped how people remembered their lives. The rising tension in this story comes from an unresolved paradox. The policy that promised dignity and shelter also produced a sense of interchangeability. Families were grateful for warmth, for running water, for privacy after years of communal living. At the same time, they felt the weight of repetition pressing against their desire to be seen as singular. Some residents cherished the solidarity of uniformity, believing it reflected fairness and belonging. Others quietly kept their dissatisfaction in notebooks, writing about the fatigue of living in a world where every window seemed to frame the same view. As time passed, cracks in the ideology widened, aging buildings began to reveal structural weaknesses, and cities that once symbolized progress now felt suspended in a continuous present. Yet, even as deterioration set in, many residents defended their neighborhoods with fierce loyalty. They spoke of the laughter that echoed through stairwells, the shared meals in narrow kitchens, the friendships formed in identical courtyards. The sameness that once unsettled them had also created a common ground, a network of experiences that connected strangers across vast distances. It is in these contradictions that the deeper human story emerges. The cities were identical, but the lives inside them were not. In a small apartment in Tbilisi, a woman kept a wooden box filled with postcards from relatives scattered across the Union. Each postcard described a city that sounded eerily similar to hers. She read them late at night, by the light of a desk lamp with a metal shade, and wondered whether her own words would sound the same to them. In another apartment in Murmansk, a retired machinist kept every official letter he had ever received in a folder stored beneath his bed. His life had been shaped by directives, allocations, and assignments. Yet the photos on his shelf told a different story. Children smiling in winter coats, a wife stirring soup in a small kitchen, a plant reaching toward a frost-covered window. The question that lingers is not only how these cities came to look alike, but how that sameness seeped into the emotional lives of those who inhabited them. To understand that, we must continue to follow the personal stories, the hidden corners of apartments, the keepsakes tucked into drawers. We must listen to how people adapted, resisted, and reimagined the spaces given to them. In many of these cities, the most revealing spaces were not the streets or courtyards, but the interiors of private rooms where people quietly negotiated their sense of self. A visitor stepping into an apartment in Yekaterinburg might notice a pattern that repeats across countless homes. A collapsible dining table pushed against the wall until guests arrive. A framed portrait above the sofa. A wall unit filled with glassware reserved for rare celebrations. But behind the arrangement lies a more intimate reality. Families stored their most personal possessions in the least visible corners. Inside a drawer beneath the bed, a girl kept a stack of letters bound with a thin ribbon, each describing the loneliness of life in another city that looked almost indistinguishable from her own. She read them slowly, savoring the tiny differences in detail, like clues that affirmed her individuality. One writer mentioned a crack in the stairwell, shaped like a lightning bolt. Another spoke of a courtyard tree that leaned at an odd angle after a winter storm. These fragments mattered because they punctured the uniformity. The invisible architecture of emotion grew alongside the visible one. Central planning imagined residents as interchangeable units within a rational system, but feelings did not obey diagrams. In interviews collected decades later, former residents described the sense of entering a new city and instinctively knowing where everything was located, yet feeling spiritually dislocated. A physician who relocated 3 times during her career explained that each move brought the same kitchen dimensions and the same bedroom size, but the emotional work of settling in never became easier. She unpacked the same enamel bowls, the same chipped teapot, the same embroidered tablecloth, as if performing a ritual of reasserting herself against an apartment that did not know her name. The cities themselves developed a strange form of anonymity. Visitors struggled to recall where a particular conversation took place or which street corner framed a pivotal moment in their lives. Memory dissolved into categories rather than places. A man remembering his youth could only say that something happened near the school or by the shop, because near the school in one city felt indistinguishable from near the school in another. The urban environment flattened narrative. It made memories portable, but also fragile. When every corner resembles another, the past becomes slippery. And yet, within this flattening, there were pockets of defiance, often expressed in small domestic gestures. Residents painted kitchen walls in muted pastel tones that were never part of official guidelines. They stitched curtains from repurposed fabric, turning leftovers into quiet statements of taste. On top of wall units, tucked just out of sight, families kept objects that did not conform to the ideology of uniformity. A tiny seashell carried from the Black Sea, a wedding photograph taken in a church before it became unfashionable to admit it, a book of poetry wrapped in brown paper to protect its fading cover. These items were not rebellious in a political sense. They were rebellious in a more intimate way, asserting that life could not be entirely standardized. Some of the deepest tension appeared in stories of children who grew up inside these identical environments and then left. When they moved to other countries or into new styles of housing, they often found themselves haunted by the proportions of the rooms they had left behind. One woman recounted standing in a spacious, modern apartment years later, feeling uneasy because the kitchen did not close in around her in the familiar, narrow rectangle of childhood. The open space felt luxurious but disorienting. She missed the intimacy of the cramped layout, the way people brushed past each other while cooking, the sound of a spoon striking the same thin enamel pot her mother once used. The standardized architecture had shaped not only her daily life, but her understanding of closeness, comfort, and belonging. Meanwhile, for those who stayed, the sameness hardened into a form of identity. Cities that began as copies developed their own emotional climates over time. A block in Minsk might feel quieter, heavier, with snow packed into concrete seams, while a block in Tashkent carried the heat of summer in its walls and the smell of fruit from distant markets drifting into stairwells. Residents began to reinterpret their surroundings, finding local meaning inside imported geometry. They spoke about the angle of light through their windows, the way evening shadows fell across the same balcony rails, where generations had hung winter coats to air out. Even within repetition, time inscribed uniqueness. The promise of equality embedded in standardized planning collided with the subtleties of social life. Though apartments were intended to be uniform, status crept into the smallest variations. A corner unit that captured better sunlight, a renovated kitchen with a newer stove, a rare extra meter of floor space that became a point of pride. In diaries, people wrote about these distinctions with a delicacy that revealed how much they mattered. A few centimeters of difference could change how a family saw itself. It turned an indistinguishable apartment into a symbol of earned progress, even if the walls around it matched thousands of others. Migration continued to scatter lives across the Union, linking distant cities through shared architecture. In the stories of railway workers, teachers, and engineers, one hears a recurring refrain. Every move meant learning the same spaces all over again. A hallway, a kitchen, a balcony, a courtyard square framed by buildings like sentinels. People developed rituals for claiming new apartments as their own. They scrubbed the floors with vinegar, wiped soot from radiators, placed a photograph on the shelf before unpacking anything else. These rituals were less about cleanliness than psychological grounding. They were ways of saying, "This is my life, even if it was designed for someone I will never meet." In the midst of sameness, unpredictability emerged through the senses. The hum of radiators varied from building to building. The smell of meals drifting through walls shifted with every neighbor's recipe. A musician in Latvia remembered lying in bed at night listening to a neighbor practice the same violin phrase over and over. Years later, while visiting relatives in another city, he heard the same muffled sound through a similarly thin wall and felt stunned by the convergence of sound and memory. It was as if the buildings themselves preserved echoes of earlier lives. Architecture shaped not only memory, but imagination. Children growing up in these apartments often drew floor plans in their notebooks, sketching the same rectangular rooms again and again, adding imaginary expansions that could never exist in reality. Some drew secret passageways behind wardrobes or hidden rooms above stairwells. Their fantasies stretched outward from the constraints of their environment, creating dream spaces beyond the limits of standardized construction. In this way, imagination became an unplanned architecture, one that coexisted with the concrete panels and factory-produced doors. As political and economic conditions shifted, the identical cities began to age unevenly. Some blocks were renovated, their facades brightened with new paint and insulation. Others sagged under neglect, their stairwells dim and cracked, their courtyards hollowed out by time. Yet even in decay, residents often spoke with tenderness about their neighborhoods. They remembered the rhythm of footsteps on the stairs, the sound of winter boots scraping ice from the threshold, the warmth of kitchens crowded during celebrations. What had once felt oppressive became woven into the narrative of their lives. The sameness that constrained them had also held their memories in place. There is an emotional complexity in hearing former residents speak about leaving these places. Many describe a moment of standing in an empty apartment just before departure, looking at the pale outline on the wall where a picture once hung, at the faint indent in the floor where a chair had rested for decades. They saw not just repetition, but traces of themselves engraved into the sameness. One man recalled running his hand along the chipped edge of a windowsill one last time, feeling its roughness as if it were a scar on his own skin. For years, he had resented the apartment for its uniformity. In that final moment, he felt gratitude and grief bound together. And still, beneath these stories lies an unresolved question. What happens to a sense of individuality when it grows inside an environment designed to erase differences? Some people emerge from identical cities with a heightened need to distinguish themselves, collecting vibrant clothes, unusual furniture, or handmade art as soon as they could. Others internalized the quiet discipline of uniform living, preferring order, symmetry, and predictability wherever they went. The architecture did not dictate who they became, but it shaped the emotional vocabulary through which they encountered the world. Today, many of these cities remain, their repeating facades softened by time and personal expression. Balconies are enclosed in mismatched glass. Curtains glow in different colors. Satellite dishes cling to exterior walls like improvised ornaments. What was once uniform now carries the texture of countless lives layered upon it. The buildings have become archives, holding within them the stories of migrations, childhoods, disappointments, dreams, and fragile gestures of uniqueness. They stand as evidence of a grand experiment in planning and of the deep human need to leave a personal mark, even on the most standardized of landscapes. To walk through these neighborhoods now is to feel the weight of history bound to intimate detail. You notice a child's drawing taped to a door, a faded rug draped across a balcony railing, a row of shoes lined neatly in a corridor. You sense how ideology once tried to compress life into formulas, and how life quietly expanded anyway, seeping through cracks in concrete, filling rooms with smell, sound, laughter, and longing. The cities may still look alike at a distance, but up close, they reveal what was always there, hidden in plain sight. The stubborn individuality of the people who turned identical apartments into homes. If you'd like, I can reflect further on specific aspects of these stories, or explore how these identical cities continue to shape identity and memory in the present day.